Okay, I'll make a start. Well, thank you to the 36 of you, I suppose, and 37, including myself, that are here. This is one in a series of these events that we're kind of doing during the lockdown. Hopefully, some of you were on the similar session last week when Roger Evans, or Kasha hosted Roger Evans, setting out some kind of thoughts and ideas on where we might go once we eventually get released from lockdown. I see I just had the news flash come up that apparently Boris is going to tell us next week how and when we're going to be released. So that's something to look forward to. Roger sort of provided a bit of an overview across a number of themes, and there was quite good discussion afterwards. And we kind of took it away and we said, well, what we'll do is we'll have a series of events over the coming weeks about. Sorry, my phone's ringing, which is not very helpful. We'll have a series of events over incoming weeks and kind of drill down into each of those topics in a bit more detail. So tonight we're looking at retail and work. It's very much designed to be an interactive session. So please kind of think about any comments or ideas you have on sort of retail and work generally, how the kind of post-COVID world might be different to what it would have been beforehand. I've got a very brief presentation that I'll go through, which it's actually taken from a piece of work that our practice did last year with the GLA, and I've kind of adapted it slightly for COVID. But just for maybe those of you that weren't here or weren't on the call last week, so Roger kind of covered a number of points in his presentation, and I suppose the key ones really were what are we learning about the nature of retail? Obviously, the high street being in decline, the increase in online retail is nothing new, but what has happened over the past few weeks is a lot more people are now using online retail. A lot more people are getting home supermarket deliveries. What will happen afterwards? Are these people going to continue to do that if they've maybe found the advantage of it, or do we think they'll go back to old ways? So kind of what's that impact going to be between the in-person and the online from shopping? I think also, obviously, more and more we're looking at town centres being more than just retail. I think that's something which is kind of been talked about quite a lot pre-COVID, but I guess has the situation we're in now and the working from home and people maybe shopping more locally, is that something which we think will change how we consider town centres going forward? For those of you that were possibly on the session last night, we had what would be our sort of regular monthly event, normally held in Cowcross Street, was held online last night, and that really was talking about the future of high streets. It was an event to come out of the current journal, which hopefully most of you have got a copy of. If not, please sign up to become a member and you'll get sent a copy of the latest journal. But really that was looking more at kind of what is the future of high streets, and the high streets task force is still working in the background, and I think in the coming months that will start to gear up and do a lot more work as well, looking at how high streets may change in the future. But also kind of not just talking about high streets and town centres, but out of town as well. And Roger made the point that in the past few decades now, we've seen both retail and employment actually move out of town. We think about out of town retail parks, but we've also got just as many jobs in out of town business parks as we have in town centres. And are they going to move back in? There was some interesting debate and discussion last night around the sort of the large institutional investors, the pension funds, who maybe historically would have invested in business parks and retail parks, but are now looking more at and are more interested in residential build to rent products. So actually there's more options and more diversity for them, or will they start to move towards sort of build to rent products rather than business parks and retail parks? And he also touched on the kind of the history of the office, and actually the idea that an office generally is quite a modern construct, sort of early 1700s, the first purpose-built office in London for the East India Company. And before that, really, people just tended to work where they lived. We had, the townhouse was a typical example of people living and working from the same place. And as Roger points out, as the Prime Minister still does indeed live and work from the same place, with number 10 being a great example of a mixed use building in a kind of residential scale. So I think thinking a bit about how we might look to change things. Clearly, one of the things that I've been finding over the past 6 weeks of doing various Zooms and team calls is actually the massive diversity of people's environments. Some people seem to have spacious, quite palatial studies and office spaces at home that they can use, while other people are perched on the end of the bed with their laptop sitting on an ironing board. So I think if we are going to be working from home, it's something that maybe we need to think about in terms of the quality of our urban, our home spaces. I don't know. I saw on Twitter someone had commented about, interesting to get the view of people that live in sort of these micro apartments and the like, of how they're working at a time of lockdown. But what I'll just do briefly is to run through this piece of work, which, as I said, was something that we did last year. Hopefully this is going to work. No, it's not going to work. Hang on. 1 second. Right. Try that again, see if it works now. Right. Try that. Right. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. So this was, as I said, it was a piece of work we did. I think it was last year. I'm losing track of time. I don't know what day it is or what year it is, but I think it was either 2018 or 2019, and it was funded by the GLA Good Growth Fund, and it was a project called Pavilion Places. It was looking at how we can make use of underused retail stores, and one thing in particular that we looked at, which is what I'm going to talk about today, is about the use class orders. Now, again, planning was something that was touched on last night in the session in terms of, is the planning system fit for purpose? And really what we were looking at in this study was the kind of existing system, and do these quite strict use classes reflect how we live today, and in fact, how we kind of operate and how businesses work today. Clearly, there's a need for some sort of system. There are certain types of establishment are seen as being problematic or bad neighbours, and there needs to be a way of managing them. But actually, what this kind of relatively inflexible system does is it does prevent a quick and easy change from one to another. And obviously, we're kind of seeing, I guess, three threats now. There's the general decline in the high street, and the kind of boarded up shops, as we're seeing here in an existing sort of older high street area. There's a lot of new build. This is a fairly common site. This is actually East Village, the Olympic Park, but typical mixed-use building. You put a retail unit on the ground floor, but there's no demand for it. You might get Sainsbury's into one of them, but as you can see here, they've got a retail unit at both corners of this block, and both corners are just boarded up with timber. This is a bigger problem because even if someone wanted to take that space on a temporary or short-term basis, the cost of putting in windows and doors would be prohibitive. So actually, should more be done to make developers make these spaces usable from day one? And how can we encourage people and businesses into them, even on a short-term or pop-up basis? And then this kind of one which I've added in. So this is, I think, somewhere down in the southwest, but it's, what we're seeing now, the queuing for shops. Certainly, I'm sure for many others, like it is for me, the kind of, when you do go out, and now there's massive queues down the high street, and sort of we've got two queues crossing. You've got the queue for Boots going one direction and the queue for Sainsbury's going in the opposite direction. Everyone very patiently stood 2 meters apart. But what does this mean for the high street, and is it going to change things? A lot of shops that might have been restaurants or cafes where people would sit in and moving to a delivery model, but then obviously there are complications with delivery. I don't know whether anyone saw the great image yesterday of all the kind of Deliveroo and Uber Eats drivers sitting, I think it was from somewhere in Thailand, where they were all kind of in a shopping centre sitting 2 meters apart while they were waiting for orders to collect to then deliver to people. Meanwhile, while you're getting these kind of boarded up shops, you're also getting an increase in street markets. This is Leather Lane Market in London, a very popular food market. We did some work with the local business improvement district in Hatton Garden, and part of that was looking at how we can kind of boost these types of facilities. And obviously the spin-off from having these as a street food market is that it does help the shops along the street as well. Very popular, very busy at lunchtime with workers. Particular issues that you often get with markets: waste management, servicing, people getting in and out. Not in this particular photo, there's some tables there on the right, but one issue they have here is it's a food market and there's not actually that many spaces for people to eat. So a lot of people have to take their food back to their office. So is there scope for kind of having smaller spaces to the side where people can actually sit and enjoy their food? But what we're finding is that more and more people are setting up businesses like this, and one of the reasons is the relatively low barriers to entry. There's some criticism that it's a bit of a kind of middle class aspiration, and I think we're also seeing popular other street markets. This is Roman Road again near our office in Hackney, and this isn't certainly this isn't a middle class market. This is a very much down to earth. It's good value. It's food. It's clothes. It's hardware. It's housewares. But it's really busy. It's really popular. It's well patronised by the local population. And then we've sort of seen in the recent years the pop-up shop. So this is an Appear Here unit. I think this is in Peckham. Kind of empty retail unit. You can go on the Appear Here website. You can take this on for a while, but there are still relatively complicated barriers. You still need to make sure that it's got the right permission in place. If you wanted to move into this and set up a takeaway food business, you'd have to get you have to get permission to do it. It's not practical to do that if you only want to be in there for a month or to test an idea. Or what if you want to do two different things? It doesn't necessarily fit within the current system. Pop-up stuff like this is found an image on the internet. This is from when IKEA did a pop-up restaurant in London a few years ago now, and they just took over an empty retail unit, decked it out with a load of their stuff, and sold their ever popular meatballs. But this kind of idea of just being able to open something up and run it on a very short-term basis, I think this was open for about a month or 6 weeks, and kind of use it as a way of testing. So what we then started to look at was this idea of a new use class. We called it F simply because the letters go up to E at the moment. But the idea being that you would look carefully at what could and couldn't go into this, and certain uses that you can have, and it might be that it's limited, or that no one occupier could be in there for more than 3 months or 6 months or a year before you'd have to apply for full permission to change it. But it allows people to try things out. So, it could be a florist shop, it could be a yoga studio, it could be someone who's doing pottery that wants to use it to sell their vases and their pots, or a restaurant, a pop-up restaurant idea that someone's got, or even an office or a showroom for a kind of professional services company. And the idea is it's very flexible, it's very quick, it's very easy. It would be serviced. There'd be a way that people could move in and very quickly and particularly very cheaply sort of take over the unit and set up and running with it. This is an example of one of these types of stores that's done as a pop-up. Simple trestle tables, products that people are selling or making in some cases, and just as a way of getting stuff very quickly to market. Ribman, incredibly popular stall on Brick Lane, sells his rib rolls. I've spoken to him in the past. He would love to be able to go into a unit, but he needs something that's quick and easy, and setting up his stall is pretty quick. And he's now online. He's now selling more meat and hot sauces online since the COVID crisis than he sells in a week on his market stall. And he would love the opportunity to actually have a permanent retail outlet, but he had one once at Euston Station and it didn't work out because of costs and because of the complications around it. So now he's very wary of doing it, although he would still like to do something. So that really was all I just wanted to do. It was just to flick through a few ideas to kind of come up with and stimulate some debate. And yeah, so over to everyone else. Feel free to chip in any ideas or thoughts or comments.
Paul, I've got a couple of thoughts.
Go for it.
A lot of what you're saying about extra use and change of use in town centres seems to me to strike a chord with the way that a lot of the workforce want to change their habits. So to some extent, we have been forced to change our habits over the last 2 months, but also we've got a group of people in Millennials and Generation Z who have filled out a lot of surveys and told us that they don't like commuting to work, they don't want to drive cars, they want to be close to where they socialise, they like mixed uses. And I can see the opportunity for much more mixed town centre uses, not just getting more office space in there, but more residential with it. Hopefully of better quality than some of the office to resi conversions that we've seen. But I can see potentially, people are not going to want to travel and commute the distances they did before. Maybe we get a credit system where we can use our office money to go and work in other people's offices, and we share office spaces because we'll want a bit more if we're going to be separated a little bit. And maybe you get different spaces in towns that open up for different groups of designers, or you can work in an office a couple of days a week where there's going to be people that you can talk to about commercial issues or legal issues, and we just mix up where we work an awful lot more.
No, I think it's a good thought. I think certainly, there's a lot of people who probably hadn't really thought about working from home who have been forced to, and I think there will certainly be a shift. I think in some ways it's making me still see the value in offices. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm quite keen to see some new faces and chat to some people in real life that I haven't seen for a while. So I'm quite kind of keen to get back into the office, but at the same time, I'm certainly not missing the commute, although I do find myself starting work an hour earlier and working an hour later because I now haven't got an hour's commute each end of the day. So I don't think I'm doing it quite right. But I think you're right. I think, kind of just before this started, there was a lot of talk and a lot of press around ideas like the 15-minute city and what the mayor in Paris has been looking to do with her 15-minute city ideas. In fact, I saw an interview with her, I think it was yesterday, where she sort of said that, despite all this, she doesn't want to water down or to delay what she's been looking to do because as a result of this. And actually, if anything, it's almost driven home how important this idea is that you can work and live in a smaller area. It's great being out and seeing loads more people walking and cycling around. I live in the suburbs and most people drive everywhere, and it's been really fascinating actually to see the number of people that are walking and cycling, and how much busier I think local shops are. Certainly those that deliver are obviously doing better than those that don't, but I think it really has kind of changed. People have been forced to change their habits, and hopefully, while I have concerns that there'll be a rise in private car use because people will be worried about using public transport, I think the main advantage will be that there are a number of people that might actually just see the advantage of working from home and not going anywhere, really.
Well,
yeah.
One of the when you're talking about use class orders, there's an awful lot about planning that I don't even begin to understand. But we used to take architecture and urban design students to Amsterdam in the late 70s and 80s and started looking at there was an outburst of what they called sensitive urban renewal. And I can remember looking at some buildings in the Jordans where the city, I suppose, had built, I'm not quite sure it was a city or housing association, had built new housing, and they had kind of boarded up shops on the ground floor, rather not dissimilar to the picture that you took, except the shops had windows. And then I can remember reading things in the 80s into the 90s about how stupid this was, all this wasted space. It was uneconomic and it defeated. It cost too much. But then I was taking photographs year by year, and what was empty space became admittedly marginal uses. First off, a community art gallery, a creche, a small kindergarten. If you now go and look at those places today, although I haven't looked at them for some years now, in the Jordans and in the area between the Rembrandt House and Newmarket, there's a new street that's almost completely rebuilt back in the 80s called St. Antonius Breestraat. And all of those retail units that were provided, presumably by a kind of planning fiat, are now fully, well, they look like fully functioning, full rental paying restaurants and shops and a whole range of things. So there's an interesting part, maybe, and whether this can be in Part F, I don't know, where your planning requirement requires it. And it takes a year or two for it to become financially feasible. But as Andy is referring to, with the example perhaps of Legal and General in Oxford, there's some more interesting big investors investing into rental income into the future rather than just shifting the stuff off the books first off. End of diatribe.
Anyone else? Joe Hollyoake.
Yeah, the restrictions of the use classification order is one side of the coin, Paul. The other side is the design of buildings to accommodate that flexibility. I remember there was a piece of research done by the Bartlett decades ago. I can't remember who the individuals were, but as I recall it, the bottom line of the research was that something like 3/4 of all of the uses of that buildings were put to in towns and cities could be accommodated adequately in a 20 square meter room in a Georgian townhouse. And I'm sure that's true, because if you look at those terraced houses in places like Broomsbury, they accommodate a huge range of different activities. But it's something that Roger Evans pointed out in his talk last week. We just don't build those kind of places anymore. It's antithetical to the way that the development and funding industry is set up. And I think if we are to have this flexibility in legal building uses that you advocate, which I agree with, we equally have to be able to design buildings which can flexibly accommodate different uses at different times. And it's going to require a revolution, I think, in the way that developers and their funders work.
I think just to add to that, and I think that's an absolutely important point, because what I've seen, and I think the Olympic Village example might be like that it's residential developers who are forced to put in a kind of non-residential unit on the corner, but they don't change the building style. So it looked like there that actually floor-to-ceiling heights on the ground floor are residential floor-to-ceiling heights. And that doesn't work for commercial units or any other use. So I think we need to get to a point where we almost need to require all ground floors to be just higher, so we get that flexibility, exactly like Joe says. And I can't see why we shouldn't be requiring that from any developer, really, so we have future flexibility.
Stephen B., I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think the other thing in terms of flexibility is the nature of tenure, the variety of tenure, and the way in which buildings and occupation is funded. The example you gave of I forget, it might have been Leather Lane, where all of the activity was in the street, and we do end up in many circumstances with lots of street activity in front of closed up shops, and that can't be right. We've got to find a way of making use of the buildings that we've got. They're going to be more useful for retail and other activities than a stall in the street. But over the last few generations, the funding of that kind of accommodation has been primarily with the large funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and so on, who no longer find retail providing the return that they seek. And I've read recently about the increasing trend towards municipal ownership of failing shopping areas, and that may be one way of doing it. If the ownership of the property isn't linked to an economic return, but providing a civic function, then it should be easier for those that might be forced into street trading to occupy those units along historic streets. And maybe there's an adjustment between local authorities and the pension funds, where the local authorities take over what used to be called retail, and the pension funds start funding municipal housing, which is a more long-term, reliable investment opportunity for their customers, their support, their investors. So I think there's a restructuring that will take a while to sort out, but a new role for local authorities as landlords might be on the way, not just for housing, but for commercial activity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I think actually, while the youth class order point is clearly a barrier to it, there are many other barriers, and as you still say, rent and what people will bid out. I think last night there was a little bit of talk about things like covenants and all the rest of it that might be a barrier for people getting in, and obviously business rates, as everyone knows, business rates are heavily criticised as being a problem. We did a calculation last year, which I think, I'm trying to remember now, I think we worked out that actually if you put VAT up by 2.5%, you would raise as much tax as is currently raised through business rates. So actually, by putting VAT up by 2.5%, what of course you then do is it means that companies like Amazon, they can't avoid putting the VAT onto products, and people that are selling in a smaller shop should then be able to reduce their prices because their overheads have gone down. They shouldn't have to put their prices up, whereas kind of Amazon doing it will be a way of creating a more even playing field between online and offline retail. I think the thing that worries me is that I find it, highly unlikely that we're not going to see an increase in VAT probably next year anyway. I think the amount of money the government's been shipping in the past month, I would have thought that increasing VAT is probably a very quick way of them trying to recoup some of that, and I kind of worry that that could then impact on the potential for revisiting things like business rates, because for quite a long time it's going to be a big focus on just trying to increase tax revenue across the board. Barry, did you want to come in? I think you're muted, Barry.
All these issues over the last 10 years, particularly since the changes of use have been going on, and there's been a considerable amount of resources that local authorities have had to expend to fight off those changes in order to protect certain uses. Now, that's primarily the change to residential, and of course, as soon as you get a fragmentation of ground floors to residential, a lot of uses depend on the cheek by jowl juxtaposition of the different uses from one another. And once they fragment, those uses find their footfall disappears and they disappear entirely. And so whilst I'm very much in favour of having a whole multitude of different types of uses and freeing from, say, an office to retail to pub, whatever it might be, if you allow residential to go in certain places, then it does have a different sort of proposition. The other thing also we experience is a lot of shoehorning of residential into the backyards of business properties, and then that has a problem in terms of their usability, because if you, for example, got a residential behind a shop unit, then you can't use that for a retail, for a cafe use, because the juxtaposition of smells and noise and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of issues in terms of how you deal with the changes of use. But I totally agree that we ought to be much more flexible. I remember going to Taiwan 20 odd years ago, and they had a land use planning map where they had mixed use zones throughout much of the city, and we could adopt that quite easily. I think quite, provided you had a list of uses which were totally acceptable in terms of ground floors.
So barriers, Wandsworth got a particular policy that they're orienting towards that sort of thing, or is it still in a state of flux?
The emerging local plan is still is still emerging, but what we've had, because I was involved in an Article 4 direction to protect pub uses, for example, and we had a lot of changes of use from pubs before they changed before they changed the policy again. Remember, we went to the House of Lords, I think it was, and to get it changed. But we were embarked on loads of Article 4s on pubs in order to protect them. And then the protection came back again. So it needed planning permission to change the use. But,
so, I mean, there's situations, say, like up in Chiswick, for example, where shops having difficulty. They want 3 months rent free. So the freeholder's saying, okay, I'll turn it to housing. And then what happens as a result, if it does occur, you get a break in the retail frontage. So you get a couple of shops one side. What would be the response to that sort of thing?
Well, in our last local plan, the inspector threw out a policy on protecting of ground floors. That's why we got a lot of shoehorning in of residential to the back of retail premises, which are certainly our town centre business people say, so we should try and protect. So it's not easy.